This is Inspiring Design, where unique innovators come together to share their knowledge, share their insight, and keep us up to date with the latest industry trends. And here's your host, Rashan Senanayak.
What's up, listeners? Today's episode is an exciting one and one of my favorite topics, design thinking. But this episode has an international twist straight from Stanford d.School. Joining me today is the head of learning collaborations for Stanford University's d.School, Ariel Raz. Ariel designs learning experiences that inspire educators to engage in creative work, as well as being a current lecturer at the School of Engineering. In the past, he has worn a number of hats within the education sector, from a college tutor to Teach for America classrooms to school founder at Kip Bloom, a middle school in the Chicago South Side. Ariel holds a Bachelor in Film and Rhetorics from UC Berkeley and a Master's in Learning, Design and Technology from Stanford University. So without further ado, let's get straight into it. Welcome to Inspiring Design, and we're going to kick off straight into your story. This is one of the most exciting topics for myself, design thinking being one of my favorite contexts. I want to get to those details, but first I want the listeners to understand where you come from. So what's been your story to date? What's your background?
Oh, yeah, I'd be happy to chat about that. And thanks for allowing me on your podcast. It's an honor to get to connect with your educators from Australia. So I came into education through hobbling together a number of experiences that when I look back at it, I realized had a trajectory, but at the time was very much looking for the next experience that felt meaningful and engaging. So throughout university, I was a tutor, and then when I graduated from UC Berkeley, it was the recession over here. So 2009, so Barack Obama had just been elected president. The economy was in shambles, and there was a spirit of renewal in the air and social service as well. So I did a program called Teach for America, which sent me to teach middle school special education mathematics in greater New Orleans in Louisiana. I taught just outside of the city of New Orleans in a place called St. Bernard Parish. Mm-hmm. And while I was teaching there, I discovered that the way that I had taught math did not serve the students that I was teaching math. I always caught on to mathematical concepts relatively quickly and really enjoyed math as a kid. And I realized that I had to unlearn how I learned in order to teach students effectively. Ultimately, what that looked like was I created a game-based pedagogy. Oh, wow. There are a number of applications of games to education. One of them is the principles of gamification being levels, right? That help motivate you. You get a skill acquired that allows you to advance to the next level, and so on. Yeah. And you're competing against other people in order to have a leaderboard and things like this. So those weren't exactly the gamification elements that I used. I used more, what I tried to create was that the gameplay, how you actually interacted with a game, was aligned to a conceptual understanding in the field of mathematics. Mm-hmm. So for example, you could think of fractions. If you're kind of breaking something apart into smaller pieces, breaking a whole into smaller pieces, and then naming the different sizes, that's very similar to what you do conceptually in fractions. Later on, I learned there's a theoretical underpinning to a lot of these called PFL, Preparation for Future Learning. The basic idea there is that we sometimes get things backwards when we say students will be able to, and we lead with the goal of a math lesson. You can actually impart a concept before you introduce the language or the symbology of it. Yeah. And then you teach the symbology and how it's communicated, say in numbers or representation with letters if it's algebra later on.
And how old were these students that you were working with?
So they're in middle school. So that would be 11, 12, 13.
Yeah.
Anyway, so what does this have to do with design thinking, which is what I do now? In some ways, not a lot, and in some ways, everything. I mean, this was the beginning of creative approaches to pedagogy that could actually transform results for students. And that's been the real thread in my career up to now. Once I finished up my 2 years in New Orleans, I helped open up a charter school in Chicago. And then I came to graduate school at Stanford, where I discovered design thinking. I actually, I was so focused in mathematics education, I didn't have as broad of a knowledge base about other types of education innovation that were happening. Just so happened to be accepted into Stanford, fortunately for me. And then my first course, I took a summer school course that was 1 week before the term started, where I took a course called Design Your Life, which is applying design thinking methodologies to how you think about your career and your trajectory. They have a great book, Dave Evans and Bill Burnett, called Design Your Life, which has the lessons from the course.
Perfect.
I recommend as a resource. And then, I'll speed up. I got an internship at the D.School. I sort of started by helping the facilitators clean up after workshops and do things like that. And then I got another internship and started teaching classes. And then eventually they offered me a job about 7 years ago. And I've been there ever since.
And what's your current role at Stanford?
So currently, I work as head of learning collaborations for the K-12 lab. That's the part of the D-School that faces out to education, K-12 education, of course. And the lab part is interesting. I mean, what we try and do is launch experiments for new initiatives in education, an opportunity that has not yet been seized upon, a resource that we believe need to exist, or a professional learning experience that might bring in, say, a new technology or a new concept really at the ready for educators. So it's a very privileged position to be able to try and look ahead and say, hey, what do we need as an education ecosystem? And then to try and create that very thing.
I love it. It's really interesting because you see a lot of things about design thinking being a transferable skill set, and you're literally living and breathing that as an example, given that you came from not a design background at all. So I love that. So before we get into the details of the topic today, give us a little bit of context about Stanford and D.School for those who might not be familiar with it. Obviously Stanford's one of the leading universities on a global scale. Where does D.School fit into that, and what relevant details would educators like to know?
Sure. So first of all, the D in D.School stands for design. The idea being, design thinking as a creative pedagogy that can be taught and as a process that can be applied. So, there's the phrase, success has many parents, but failure is an orphan. There's no official parent to design thinking because many different actors were implementing some of those strategies really in the 60s and 70s, applying particularly creative methodologies to product design. And the idea was to look at individuals who are creative and say, like, how do they do the work that they do? What are the strategies for creativity? How might we codify them? And then this didn't start at the university, it started in product design firms. So perhaps the most prominent one is called IDEO, IDEO. Still around, has offices throughout the world. And they, there's a great video about them. If you Google shopping cart IDEO, it's kind of an old school video from like 90s TV, but they do a really good job showing how these people who worked at IDEO, these designers, they weren't experts in designing X, Y, or Z, a table, a computer, a water bottle, a toy. They were experts in the process of designing. And they knew how to apply that effectively to create great products. And so eventually what happened is the founder, David Kelly, was working at Stanford as well, in the School of Engineering. And he was invited to create this institute which became the D.School. And then over time, it went from a program, I'll say, that was more peripheral to the university to one where we saw a lot more students coming in. And one of the things that was unique about the D.School and is core to the process of design thinking is the idea of radical collaboration. Mm-hmm. So their designers at the firms might come from medicine and engineering and psychology, computer science. They're on the same project team and they bring their different specialties to bear when they're trying to, say, design a new microphone for Zoom or something. Mm. At Stanford, we would pull from all of the different departments, or as many different departments as we could really get, and they would often be in the same class, sometimes on the same project team. So you can imagine if you are trying to create a better hospital intake system for an emergency room, and you have a psychologist, a computer scientist, an engineer, and a physician on the team, the breadth of ideas, the inputs for inspiration is really wide, and you can really generate a ton of ideas. So that's really one of the tenets of design thinking. And there are a lot of other process steps that help make it a powerful methodology for creative problem solving.
Yeah, absolutely. And jumping ahead, because you've kind of touched on it as a concept, do you have an official definition in that you would like to share for design thinking, for someone who might just ask, they're new to it, they've never heard of it, what is design thinking?
I think we only have unofficial definitions, not official definitions.
Fair enough.
But the 4-word definition that I use when I'm trying to explain this to my mom or her friends who are struggling to understand what it is that I do, is I say it's a creative process that we use to make something that matters.
Love it.
So there's a emphasis on making things, making physical prototypes that are testable and tangible and can go out in the real world.
And usually specific towards a particular type of user.
Sure. Yeah. And that's how you figure out the second part, what matters, right? You want to study the person you're designing for, understand their needs, their aspirations, their challenges. And so you can be sure that in the making of the thing, it actually fits the context and the needs of the person who's going to use it.
Perfect. Love it. So you mentioned that this is a concept that's been around since the 60s and the 70s. What did it used to look like? And have you seen and noticed in its evolution to today's modern age?
So I in my time, there have been, I think, a number of changes. I'm not I wasn't around in the 60s and the 70s.
Yeah,
and I haven't studied the period very closely, so I'm not as much in a position to say how it's changed since its inception. I mean, certainly the transition from being a process that was applied mostly in the product design space to something that was taught, we needed to codify design thinking and create instructional materials around it that could be replicable. So that certainly happened earlier on. What I've seen in my time as the application of design thinking to from looking at products and services to then thinking about experiences, looking a layer above, you might say, to designing for systems. And now I think what you're seeing is the change of technology that's available, and the power of some of that technology is so potent that designing becomes a needed skill, but a more challenging skill. So if you take something like an algorithm, right? Like those really define a lot of the behaviors that for how we engage in the digital world. But how do you design an algorithm, right? There's a very high technical know-how that's required. So part of what we do as an institution of learning is to create ways where that a high schooler might be able to see an algorithm as a design tool where we strip away some of the technical know-how, but we still communicate the concept of it. My colleague Carissa Carter has a great quote about this, which is, you don't need to know the code in order to understand what the code can do. So we put our emphasis there. What can the code do? And how can you shape different aspects of the code? Really letting young people mold that And then that may catalyze an interest in designing algorithms and jumping into more of the technical aspects of it, but starting with the concept rather than the code or the technology is.
Of course, and that's where I think you would collaborate with the technical experts if you're not the technical expert, and bring in the right different types of people, but it still comes back down to that original concept of getting the product or whatever the thing that matters right before you actually start building it or actually putting it in front. So that makes perfect sense. Now, there are usually in Australia, there are a number of key values of design thinking that we usually discuss from an education perspective.
Right.
The three that always comes to the forefront is empathy, collaboration, and experimentation. What are your thoughts on it? And do you see other ones, or is it a stemming of this, considering you're on the other side of the world?
There are a number of different ways that we see design thinking codified, explained, and communicated, and they all have different benefits and disadvantages or detriments. I'm not particularly attached to one or the other. I think empathy is a core design thinking skill, like you being able to understand the person you're designing for, with their context in mind. So it's not just your idea of them, but really understanding what it's like to be who they are and the context that they live in, the set of relationships and associations they have. That is core. And that's really where the innovation flows from. Absolutely. Is having that human value. Collaboration, also incredibly important, right? How do you work with different people? How do you bring their perspectives to the table, and how do you encourage their participation through psychological safety so they feel like they can take risks and put forth silly ideas and wild ideas, because that's where a lot of the right material comes from as well.
And I think there's a component of empathy just in the collaborative component.
I agree. Yeah, you want to empathize with your colleagues as you're collaborating with them. And then the experimentation part of it also relates to collaboration and psychological safety, for you to be able to say, okay, I'm not sure this is going to work, but let's try it. Let's see what happens. Hey, it might fail, but we will have learned something from this failure. And it can drive our work forward, right? So not feeling attached, even in the language that we use, not gearing up for success per se, but orienting ourselves towards experiments that have a lot of learning value, I think is really powerful. I think the one thing I would add to whatever framework you have for design thinking, it's important to know that it's not a recipe that's meant to be repeated in the same sequence over and over again. Absolutely. These are creative strategies, and a creative strategy might be well suited to one particular moment in a context, and another time you might want to deploy a different creative strategy. So oftentimes you'll see people use a nice graphic, and it works well as an orienting framework, but after that, you really want to have different access points to the creative process. That's what happens as folks get more advanced.
Absolutely. And I think that's a very important component in design thinking. It's seen as an approach rather than a model or a method that you have to follow exactly as it is. This is something that we constantly talk with our teachers in our workshops. So this is music to my ears. So I'm loving what you're putting down. And there's been a lot of context with, especially on this end of the world, about design thinking and its connection with creative problem solving and critical thinking. They are seen as the key and core skill sets for, if I'm quoting, I think a LinkedIn report, 85% of the jobs in 2030 will need design thinking. So this notion of looking into the future of what future of work and future of education looks like, how do you see design thinking as a skill set moving forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. Design thinking helps students today become more, I'll say, able to navigate an ambiguous future by giving them strategies for solving problems and finding problems. So one thing that I think can be especially challenging for some types of students who are successful in traditional school is that they're given problems to solve. There are certain strategies and algorithms, whether it's in humanities or in math, that they can use, right? Structures like a 5-paragraph essay, strategies for solving an equation. And then they apply, and they can succeed. Well, very few jobs out in the real world are defined problems to be solved. There are jobs like that, but I think they're becoming rare. What you see as being especially helpful is being able to articulate problems that need to be solved. And design thinking is, I think, a very clear set of strategies where you can start with something tangible. Hey, I'm designing for this person, but you don't know what that person needs. And so you go out and look, you observe, you really develop that capacity to notice. And then from all of that data set, from that empathy research data set, you can start to synthesize it and say, hey, I think this is what's going on. This is an opportunity space. This might be a problem space. Why don't we investigate this further? And then you can bring to bear strategies for problem solving, ideation, prototyping, testing, things like this. So I see that as being a pretty agile skill set that can be applied to the workplace, to the future workplace. Now, it's particularly well suited to human-centered problems. Not all problems are necessarily human-centered. If I'm going to go and ask you to design a better engine for a plane, that's a technical problem, right? Not a human-centered problem.
Yeah.
But as you're working on that, you might be collaborating with a lot of different people.
Yeah.
And you may need to generate out-of-the-box ideas. That's where problem-solving strategies from design thinking can be really helpful. Hey, how do we ideate? How do we learn from analogies? Hey, how do we bring in outside voices to this conversation and really go beyond what seems like a obvious scope? Really go for ideas, to use the phrase, out of the box.
Yeah.
So because it's a collection of different strategies, perhaps the entire collection can serve some professions really well, but certainly some of the strategies are going to be able to translate to a wide variety of jobs.
Absolutely. And I think if I'm hearing you right as well, it imparts a level of professional resilience almost for their career adoption or ability to move into different sectors if needed. And I think that's where the frame of mind for this needs to be seen, for especially jobs that don't exist right now, that haven't been defined. We don't know what the world is going to be like by 2030 or even 2025 for that matter sometimes. So it's, I think, adopting, like you said, those multiple strategies and then applying it to the context that the frame of reference that they're coming from. So I love that. That's great. Now, if we were to take this through the point of view of the educator who has to show these strategies and actually teach these strategies in the classroom, what's your how do you see the relationship between design thinking and if you're an educator, regardless of the subject area?
So I think design thinking, when you bring it into the classroom, it presents a unique problem to an educator, an exciting problem, in my opinion, which is that most, if not all, educators did not grow up taking a design thinking class.
Absolutely.
So there's not that same model of, okay, well, let me take what I know from a secondary school and modernize it for my current students. It's very difficult to do. It's possible now that design thinking has proliferated. The younger batch of students have had some courses at university, but again, still fairly rare. And so one of the biggest recommendations that I make is that in order to teach design, you need to do design.
Yeah.
And so aim to find opportunities where you can innovate at your school. So that might mean, looking around at your school site and seeing if there are any challenges around space, right? Is there some point of congestion? Is there a furniture need that isn't met? Is there a particular student that has a hard time navigating the school that we might want to design a new product for? All of those things are ripe opportunities where you can start notice. There's a challenge that we've ran in the past called the Shadow Student Challenge, where we ask a school leader to take a day where they clear their schedule and they have an empathy experience. They just shadow a student for the entire day, not to assess teachers, not to assess students, just to be able to understand, empathize, understand what's it like to be a student at my school. And then guess what? When you're making decisions about lunch and schedule and new classes that you might want to teach, new content areas, all of those observations come up. Absolutely. And then you can design with that context and those users more effectively in mind. So
just on that, I think whenever, especially in the current day and age, whenever people are presented with that initial sentence you said of, clear the schedule, I think that's where a lot of people struggle with. What are your
That's where they stop.
Yeah, because they saw, we're busy, we've got 1,000 things going on, especially in a school. There are so many different faculties and, tasks that are required. What's your recommendations or advice to the clearing of a schedule to dedicate that time to actually create empathy?
Well, look, on some level, if in order to do it, you have to do it. Yeah. And if we want our students to learn according to certain values, we also need to live those values. So I was reading a book the other day called The Power of Pull, and they had a great turn of phrase: from an institution of learning to a learning institution. And in order to be a design thinker, you need to model your values for your students. It's not going to land well or effectively at all for you to tell your students they need to start learning and behaving in a new way, and they don't see you acting under those same values. And Absolutely. So finding those moments where you can really capitalize on something like this and say, hey, I'm doing it. Ultimately, it's one day out of the school year. It doesn't matter how busy you are, how loaded your schedule is. You can take one day. And the advantage is you get an incredible return on that day because you are able to be a more effective school designer. Yeah. And I think that's the frame of reference, that if you're coming from there will be an immense ROI on this time spent, all of a sudden it's not going to be seen as a burden. It's going to be seen as an incredible value towards the school environment, especially from a leadership or an educator's perspective. So perfect. Now, sorry, I did interrupt you when you were talking about the design thinking relationship with an educator and how you were in the middle of, I think, explaining looking around the context of problem solving within the school and leading by example. Was there anything else that you wanted to share on that? So the other thing that I would say is, if you're going to be a design educator, so modeling your behavior, as I was saying, is incredibly important for you to be able to not just show your students, but also be deferential to the fact that you're going to be learning along the way. One recommendation I often make is to start small. There's a tendency when launching a new initiative to move to something particularly high stakes. Well, if you're going to be experimental and you run the risk of failing because you're being experimental, it's going to feel quite costly if it's a high stakes failure. And so you want to be honest to that process and say, okay, let me scope this in a way where I can work safely. And there's not too much emotional energy or institutional weight behind this initiative. I can both focus on my own learning and be able to share back with my community, hey, this is what works, this is what doesn't. To use a baseball analogy from the United States, no one's going to bat 100 when you are becoming a designer. What we're trying to do is increase the batting average so that you are more successful over time. But part of what engineers the success is this fail forward mentality. Well, the first word is fail, right? Fail forward, and it drives learning. The other thing that I would say, and it is related to that, is sometimes we are given design thinking challenges which aren't actually well suited to design. Like you might have a school leader come in and say, hey, can you do a design challenge around this new furniture that we've purchased? Well, if you've already purchased the furniture, there's not much of a design space there.
Yeah.
We've already decided this is the furniture we need. Okay, so we can arrange it in particular ways. That's a fairly narrow problem. So an important skill to develop is, how do I identify the right challenge? And it's a challenge where empathy research, right? Human-centered insights about behavior and what governs or informs or affects human behavior is going to be non-obvious and is going to yield results. Those are the challenges that you want to look for.
Absolutely. And I think one of the advices that we always work with the teachers that we train is constantly taking it back to good design principles that are usually centered around either the SDG goals, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So you're coming from a frame of reference of maybe it's the conservation of water or hunger, or something that's very close and near to human, so that it is abroad, it is uncomfortable, it can be very big, but there are narrower problems if they wanted to scope it down. So the scalability is also there. And but I'm loving what you're hearing, and because that's, I think, the key component of being able to suit the design challenge as an educator. That's another skill set for them. 100%. Now, what's your advice for, say, Australian schools in the adoption of design thinking towards their pedagogies? If you had to speak to every principal in Australia, what's your message to them?
Well, that's quite an opportunity. Thank you for that. In terms of implementing design thinking, I would say start with your students. Start with the students that you're designing for. Oftentimes the voices that are loudest in the education concern, in the ecosystem, in the design, are the voices of adults. And so I'm always a huge fan of bringing in student voices into the process wherever possible, so we can design for them. I mean, that's what schools are meant to do. The Shadow a Student challenge that I mentioned earlier, I think a part of the power there is to say, hey, like, who is the experience for in a school? It's for the student. Let's understand that experience more effectively. And that's where you can really make a match of things. So to give a more recent example, a very current example, ChatGPT. Right? Everyone is, on my LinkedIn, I have every other post is about ChatGPT, which is interesting. There's a great quote from the Institute of the Future. We tend to overestimate the impact of technology in the short term and underestimate in the long term. And that's my prediction for ChatGPT, is we're overestimating it right now, and then it's going to quiet down, go away, and then 5-10 years, it's going to be so impactful that we won't know how we got along before it, much like the iPhone. The thing that's missing in all of the posts that I see on LinkedIn is, how are students actually using this? What do they think of the relationship of learning to AI? They're the ones that are going to be living in this world. They're going to be designing with this technology. They're going to have to be able to exercise their intellect to, if we think the algorithmic effects of social media are bad now, what's that going to look like when my daughter, who's 18 months old, when she's 18 years old?
Yeah.
So I think capturing that student voice and making them a stakeholder with power is a place that I would start.
Love it. And speaking of ChatGPT, it prompted a thought in my head of technologies. It's obviously a very front and center topic as well in schools, or even in industry, pretty much everywhere we go now. There are a lot of different technologies actually playing a role within schools. There's VR, there's AR, there's AI components now obviously being integrated. There is a data concern from different countries that based on where you're at, cybersecurity issues. What's your thoughts on how design thinking plays a role with technology?
The clearest connection between design thinking and technology is that it asks the question, who is this technology for? That's at the most basic level, is the element of user research in order to inform how to make the fit between technology and person more effective. I think beyond that, there are a much wider circle of concern and an important circle of concern where we bring in ethics and we extend empathy to be saying, okay, at scale, how is this going to affect people? Is this good? So not just, hey, how do we make this in the way that's most suited to the user or most suited to our aims based on what we know about the user, which I think is more of a transactional relationship, to a questioning of, hey, is this worth making? Why and how? Can we create features that may soften some of the more pernicious effects? There's talk in the United States now of banning TikTok. And what I find most interesting about this conversation is if you look up the Chinese equivalent of TikTok that they make there are severe restrictions. You're not, if you're under 14 years old, you cannot use it between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. The app is just shut down. And then I believe you're not allowed to use it, or you're not able to use it for more than 40 minutes per day.
Yeah.
So there are these incredibly strong restrictions. We don't have those same restrictions in the Western world. And I think that there's an important level of design thinking, looking at a systems level and being able to say, hey, this might be compelling use for a user, but does it have damaging effects? What does this do to social life? What does it do to social behavior? And then if we're going to accept the fact that this technology will exist, what controls can we put in place so that it's being used safely and still allowing our young people to have safe and healthy lives?
Yeah. No, I think that's well said. And it's very important it keeps going back to that, you got to understand the broader picture and the information. Sometimes a lot of people aren't aware of what's happening in the same app that they're using. The TikTok being a very good example of how it's used in China versus in Australia or in the US or maybe in Russia or Africa. I think that's the crucial part. So it always comes back down to going and understanding and broadening your viewpoint, knowing more information, taking the time to gather that information and looking at it from an empathetic lens. So I love what you've said. I feel like we can talk about this topic for the whole day, but given the fact that this is a podcast recording, I'm going to go towards the end questions. And usually I always like to ask my speakers and guests some advice for students and graduates, especially within the context of design thinking. Do you have any advice for them, or even any resources? You've already named a few. What's your advice for them?
What's my advice for students? Beautiful. My first thought is to get your hands involved. The education system is really good at teaching our brains. It doesn't always teach our hands. It doesn't always teach our hearts. And the amount of technology that is available that allows you to make amazing things just with your fingers and with your brain, some persistence is totally incredible. So in that way, it's an incredibly exciting time to be in life. You can create incredibly high resolution things in a much shorter amount of time. And so I think that that's super exciting. And you just really got to start using your hands. The other thing that I would say that I think is really important, and more a skill level to be developed, is your powers of observation. To take a step back from your daily life and look at all the things that you do in different ways. Like pay attention to your feet for a day. I did one project where I was fortunate to go into a museum that wanted to design a exhibit for kids. And so I walked in and I asked all of the gallery designers to walk on their knees for an hour and just navigate the museum and see what they notice, see the change in scale. And it's incredible. They work at this museum and they see everything through a completely different lens, and they observe so much. We are incredibly capable observers as humans, but we tend to have a hard time breaking out of our normal day-to-day way of operating. that's a challenge. But the beautiful thing is it's actually quite easy to just wear a different lens for a minute or an hour or a day. So that would be a practice that I would encourage any young person to take on. You'll really learn a lot from.
And I think that's good advice
lenses.
for even the educators and the adults of the world, like even the example you just said. And I've come from a similar standpoint, and season 2 of my podcast is actually the students' point of view, purely to understand how they, the challenges that they observe and the things that they go through, the problems, and how they observe design from different angles. I think it's really important, and the sheer amount of information that they shared was a complete surprise for me, other than the obvious ones that I did foresee coming. So that's, I think, really, really valuable there. What's your, if you could give some advice for the educators, just as a final design thinking tidbit, what would it be?
A final tip for the educators. Well, just a plug for my organization. We've got a ton of resources on the d.School website that you can really tap into. As an educator, I always just loved resources, like beautiful resources that are well crafted. The other one I would recommend is we are publishing a series of books. One of them has a ton of different activities that you can pull from. It's called Creative Acts for Curious People. And in it, the executive director of the d.School, Sarah Stein Greenberg, she connected with all of the instructors across the d.School, which is really, really wide. We have instructors from Stanford and outside of Stanford who come in. And she took the best learning experience ideas, activities, little tasks, and she codified it into this beautiful book. So that's one where, hey, if you want to teach in this way, but you're not sure where to start, get that book. And it's just got a library of activities that you could adopt into your own instructional practice.
Perfect. We will link those things in the show notes as well, so that people can access them really quickly. And lastly, if they want to get in touch with you and learn more, what's the best method?
You can just email me. My name's Ariel, Ariel, and the email address is ariel@dschool.stanford.edu. I reply to all my emails. So if anybody wants to learn more, I have open office hours. I'm always very happy to connect with educators who are doing good work. So reach out to me and I will write you back.
Perfect. And I think hopefully there'll be Australian educators that take you up on that offer. And last mystery question. This is a bit of a random one, but but I've been thinking about what I should actually ask you, and I've landed on one question. It is a little bit related, so it's not completely random. If you could change one thing in schools, what would it be?
So I do have an answer for this. I would, in the US especially, schools are attached to zip codes and they're attached to locations. I would completely disrupt that. So your child was bused to a school somewhere in the region. You had no say, you had no choice in the matter of what public school your child was sent to. And my hope would be that would change how we think about schools in the US, and that we cared about every single school. We made sure that it had the necessary resources, the necessary staffing, and that would lead to just more effective schools across the board in the United States.
Love it. It's a similar situation in Australia. There are catchment areas which govern that. So I think that's a very, very cool insight, and hopefully someone might design a challenge, at least at a conceptual level, to explore that. Love it. Perfect. Thank you so much, man. It's been an absolute blast. I honestly feel like we can genuinely talk for hours on this, but for the time being, I think it's been an immense value. I've learned a lot from yourself, and I'm sure the listeners will take so much away from it. So thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure, Sean.
That's it for today's episode. Now it's time to take action and build on the learnings to get inspired. First up, jump onto rashansenanayaka.com/podcast and check out the show notes, links, and other relevant learning materials from this amazing episode. Next, if you learned something new today, click that subscribe button and set yourself up to receive live notifications on future episodes, as well as more opportunities to learn from our amazing guests, brands, and speakers. Last but not least, it's time to have your say. Join the conversation and share your thoughts and feedback on today's episode with a review, all while joining many others with a 5-star rating for Inspiring Design with Roshan Senanayake. Till next time.